and somewhere something is shorting out, and I hear it, and I have no idea what I'm gonna do. I mean, these wires go everywhere. I guess I should have tested before I went live. Probably would have made sense, and I could have been able to find out. Or, yeah, I did test, but I went and did a software update right before the show. Oh, I don't even know where to start. This is making my head hurt. Hey guys, has this ever happened to you? Have you ever gone on and done a show, whether it's 15 minutes before or during your intro, something catastrophic hits, and instantly in your world, it just stops? For that brief 45 seconds, you go into total and utter panic. What do you do? Well, that's something we're going to talk about today on social. My name is Stephen Haywood. I'm joined as always by Marty McPadden from podjam.tv. Welcome.
How you doing, Steven? That was quite an intro there.
Well, I got to keep everybody on their toes. And
That's right.
we've also got from his man cave there, we've got Mr. Jeffrey Fitzgerald from jeffandhighdef.tv. Welcome.
Hey, I want to pull up my crocodile voice. It looked like we were looking for snakes back in there.
Well, you just never know. Hey, we're in eastern Ohio. Stranger things have happened, right? But
Yeah.
this is something that people face with day in and day out, whether they're doing mobile, whether they're doing professional, whether they're doing any form of live show, live streaming, if you will, on social media. Bad things can happen, and it doesn't matter how much you plan, you troubleshoot, you isolate. Something is always bound to happen, and I sound a bit pessimistic when I say this, but in reality, I plan for the worst and I hope for the best. And the reason I do that is because it puts me in a mindset that I have 2, 3, or 4 different backups, even for this show, right? So we're backing this up 3 different places for recordings. So if something happens to one, I have 2 more that I can fall back on. Might be overkill, but guys, we'll start with you, Jeff. Catastrophes. Has it ever happened to you?
Oh, never. It's never happened. I walk in, I basically bring my Taco Bell stuff, throw it down, and be like, one button and everything's beautiful. Tight bandwidth, never a problem. Except that's not true. Absolutely. I mean, it's one of these things where, there's a million different connections, and we all know at a level that we're all striving for, better lighting, better microphones, audio, adding a box here, a box there. Every single one of those components has another element of, well, what might have went wrong. And so the more that you add, you've really got to become kind of a detective. It's like NCIS, streaming media. And it's one of these things where if you're not careful and you're bumping up, not getting your time in before your show starts, you're going to be doing it while you're doing your show.
Absolutely. And Marty, I know you and I have faced many challenges, but you too, right? You've had this scenario happen.
Oh, absolutely. And it's always the last thing you think of. But yeah, I mean, those surprises always creep up, and we'll get into it a little bit. Um, Having those like you mentioned just before, having those backup systems in place are so important, even though you hope to never use it. It's almost like that the break glass if necessary, and grab the fire extinguisher. You hope you never use it, but it's good that you have it in case you need it. But yeah, we'll get into some of those scenarios that can happen, especially when you're doing live video. I mean, with bandwidth and all that stuff. So I'm sure we've all had that happen to us.
I think one of the things that I've seen um, is people get in these predicaments and they panic and they don't understand and know their gear, know their setup enough to troubleshoot it. And that's what I was hoping we could kind of dialogue a little bit today, because you know, we see a lot of people that they'll pay for somebody to come in and set up their studio. They'll pay for somebody to come in and and put everything together. And I know when John came into my studio and set up the neural net system, I asked him every step that he did it, him and his son. What was wired where? How was it wired? Was he pulling this audio feed from my mixer? Was he pulling this SDI cable from my router system? And the reason for that was I wanted to know exactly how it was wired. So in the event something happened, I could trace it back all the way back even to my network. So I have a standard router set up to a modem, and then I come off of that on the backside behind me, everything that's networked behind me. That includes my rack and all the computers that might be behind me. That's the best way I can put it for this demonstration. That's all on one net switch. I come out of that net switch and I go into a net switch that's under this table, and that has every computer that's here in it. And then I come out of that net switch, go over to my workstation, which is my daily jobber, where I do my work and all the other computers. That's in one net switch. And the reason I do that is if one of the net switches goes, I can isolate the problem fairly quick, and I always keep an extra net switch on hand that I can swap it out in the event of a catastrophe. But that might be going a little overboard. But what's your thoughts on that? I mean, is isolation the key, Jeff?
Yeah, it is. It's actually the key, and I think in tandem with that, it's when you're trying to figure out a troubleshooting scenario, especially when you're panicking, like you talk about, it's what has happened most recent that you might want to pay attention to. I did a live stream 2 or 3 years ago with a room full of people in Washington D.C. It was all ready to go, and 15 minutes before the stream, we noticed that one of the cameras had not been brought up. We were going through some checks, and I was like, why didn't you guys check that? And they go, well, we got a new, we ran a new cable and everything. And it turned out it was an HDMI extender, and it had a particular direction that one box had to be on our end, one box had to be on the other. And if they were inverted in opposite positions, it wasn't going to work. And so they were kind of scrambling and wanted to, grab different wires and things. I'm trying to figure out what it is. And then we all said, hey, wait a minute. What was the most recent thing that you changed, or what was the newest part of the system? And I think that's where you really got to start with some of this, is really looking at the things maybe you're less familiar with, getting up to speed with them. And then, as you say, having a backup, right? I mean, having that backup cable is actually still important. So,
Yeah, I mean, Marty, you know for a fact, we've done this. You've got some notes that you kind of put together. You want to kind of dive into some of this?
Absolutely, and just to kind of play off what Jeff was saying, what he's saying about testing workflows, especially if you make any changes. The thing I would recommend is you don't want to make any serious changes, either hardware or software changes, right before a production. That's something you want to make sure you do well in advance so that you can do proper testing. There's always going to be upgrades in hardware, software that are necessary, especially software, especially if you're working with a program like Wirecast or some software-based solution. You're going to have, and if you're whatever platform you're on, Windows or Mac, you're going to have updates on the OS. You're going to have updates in the applications themselves or multiple applications. The thing is, when you do those updates, you want to make sure that they're done properly, that they're thoroughly tested and vetted before you actually do the show. In fact, testing is always good no matter what you do. Before you go live, you want to have a workflow checklist in place to make sure that everything's working. Don't assume that everything's working just like the last time. In fact, and that's why also we talk about having a solid, defined workflow in place. Once you have that nailed down, do the same thing every time. And then if you need to introduce changes, again, testing is crucial. Make sure that everything works well. Don't assume that just because you do an upgrade, it's going to work perfectly. Chances are you're going to have issues, and it may not, because there's various combinations. But always thorough testing is very, very important.
That's what the chat room here on our Discord channel. They're saying, redundancy is key, consistency is key. People are saying that as well on other channels. I know for a fact, as much as I've wired everything in the studio, I know how everything is. The every cable, every power cable, every down to the T. I know, Marty, we talked about this, you and I, this week even, how having somebody in your corner that you could trust to help you troubleshoot from a secondary perspective, second set of eyes is always key. That's something I always do with you. I call you up and I'm like, hey, this is what happened. This is what I did. This is what I tried. And sometimes you find something in that whole workflow that I gave you, and you go, this is what you missed. And it's like we're able to fix it really quick because I've outlined it to you exactly how it was wired, but I missed one little simple thing. because I was frazzled and I was trying to get everything up and running. I mean, that's something we've done many times, right?
Yeah, and just to reiterate your first point about knowing your workflow, the story that you told about John Mahoney coming in and setting up the neural net, and you're asking, signal flow and where's everything going and where's that going, knowing your setup and knowing the basically the signal flow and the workflow is so important because that's the beginning stages of any kind of troubleshooting. Number two, having someone in your corner, can't overemphasize that enough how important that is. I'll tell you my story, and Stephen, you know this. I called you. Early on. I was having trouble with mix minus and setting it up properly and troubleshooting that. And you were invaluable. We spent probably a couple hours on that at least, going through everything and just having your perspective be in there and saying, "Have you looked at that? Have you looked at that part of the signal flow?" And you understanding how that works was invaluable. And the whole idea of having the other perspective, because again, when you're looking at a problem, this not only applies to video production, it applies to anything in life. If you're looking at and you're having a challenge, you only have that one perspective, kind of that tunnel vision. And if you can get people around you that you trust and say, "Hey, have you looked at it? Have you considered this?" And looking at it from a different perspective, it's invaluable. Just like the story you brought up, Stephen. You're not gonna, because I mean, you tell me stories where you're up till 3 o'clock in the morning troubleshooting something. You're frazzled,
Yeah. Oh
and you
yeah.
need that input. And it's like,
That's
have you
right.
tried? No, no, I haven't tried that. And sometimes that's all it takes.
Well, even something like this, Jeff. I mean, with us being kind of close knit here, and some of us are reviewing some of the similar products and looking at similar products. Marty mentions about the 3 o'clock in the morning, referring to the lumens because they ship those cameras at 1080p 60. Well, I have an SDI router that only handles 1080p 30, and I just could not understand why I could connect it to a capture card in Wirecast and it shows up instantly. But when I put it into
Yeah.
that workflow, I started thinking after I ran, and this was partially my fault, I ran the cable before testing it, but it was a brand new cable in my defense. So I sat there just banging my head, and then I texted Marty the next day and I said, "Hey, in case you try to do this, by default, this is set to 1080p 60." Fortunately, he had capture cards, it was not a problem, but there was nothing in the documentation telling you this. So I
Well, that's
spent
not good.
hours.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you'd wanna know, what settings are in the dip switches on a camera to let you know that, but it points to the fact that all of us, no matter who we are, we have assumptions about the gear that we work with, especially when we're with it all the time. We begin to think, "Oh, couldn't be that, must be something over here." And I've had problems even with things like the Thunderbolt cable on my iMac because it tilts. I might wanna pull the monitor a little closer, and I've it in a built-in console, but sometimes one of the cables might get a little, caught on something, and it's literally looks like it's plugged in, but it's not. And you're like, "Oh, it couldn't be that." And then you really kinda step away and go, what might the problem be? Then you begin to look at it more objectively, and things start coming together. And I mean, and it also your point is also well taken in that it's good to write some things down, or when you have somebody working with you, that you've got somebody that understands them the way you do, because you're right. All of us are kind of under the hood here. This is our, you know, um, 2000s version of working on cars. You're in there on a Friday night running cables and things. We know what it looks like, but if no one else does, it's still going to be a problem if you've got to have other people in the mix. So there's a lot to be said for collaborating, making sure people understand what the dynamics look like when you're on a production set and that kind of thing.
And this is something we talk about often, and I'm just going to kind of show everybody here. If you're using professional grade equipment, whether it's HDMI, SDI, a lot of times you're going to have some of these in your studio. They're converters, HDMI to SDI converters. Now, fortunately, I run all SDI, but there are some that I need these for TVs. I need to convert an SDI signal from my router to HDMI to go into the TV. I have about 15 of these that are not being used, but I also have ones that are connected to about 5 different TVs in here. But I have about 15 of these, not all the same make, not all the same brand, in my cabinet that's under my rack. Why? Because in the event, 15 minutes before a show, one of the TVs are not receiving a signal. Guess what? I don't even troubleshoot it. I pull one of these out that I know works, that is brand new. I plug it in, boom, I get a picture. Then I write on the back of it, bad, and then I contact the company to see if it's still under warranty and get it replaced and shipped out. The other thing I do, and these were cameras that I used to use here in the studio, I have about 8 of these. These are Vixia HV40s. These were probably the last of the great HV cameras with FireWire, but also have HDMI. I have two just sitting here, okay? And I have probably about four more sitting in there. I have a few at the church too, but I have them inside inside of my cabinet. Why? Well, I would only use maybe four at a time, only for different shots, and I wouldn't always use them. But in the event right before a show, these were known to have the servos die in them after so many hours. Okay, so what happens? I'm on time sensitive, a time sensitive job or a show, right, guys? I mean, I got
That's
to be able
right.
to swap this in about 3 minutes to go live. And it sounds overkill, but these are the things that people need to think about when they're going in to troubleshoot their setup. Somebody mentioned in
Yeah,
the
and
LinkedIn chat about cables. Go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, it's great that you've got a, plethora of gear to pull from, and that is absolutely the way that you wanna do it when you're trying to do it professionally and you wanna have guaranteed redundancy. But let's say that you're somebody that doesn't have multiple cameras, you may only have one of what you need. One of the things you can do in troubleshooting or in planning for troubleshooting is, using a product like Wirecast, where you have a shot to go to if you can't get your guest up, and you have them through audio, or having some other video you can play while you're trying to figure out what might be going on. Having the ability to do that kind of thing and change the content a little bit to kind of cover while you're in that recovery mode, trying to figure out if you're rebooting, whatever it might be. Sometimes those things can be really valuable as well.
No, that's a good point. And Marty, I know you do a lot of podcasting, editing and stuff now. I'm sure you have some form of redundancy with the recording stuff.
Oh, absolutely. So I double record everything. So I use a system when I'm doing managed recording. A lot of my work is editing, but when I'm actually managing the recording process, I record. There's a system I use. It's a browser-based recording system. I can record multiple tracks, but I also do a safety record separately, outboard record, so that way I'm covered. There's always a double record. I know, Stephen, you do the double records for the show. It's about having that backup in case something goes wrong. At least you have something to go back to. The other thing is, I think you mentioned about power cords. Um, it's usually the simplest thing. So, how many times have we seen where it's usually a power cord or something that's not seated in there right? Lots of times with HDMI, if you use an HDMI system, since those cords are not a locking cord like SDI, like a BNC connector would be for SDI, it could be easily unseated. It doesn't take that much to be unseated, and it's the simplest thing. It's like the concept. I'm not sure if you guys have heard the concept of Occam's razor, which is an old. I'm not sure where it comes from. It's Greek or something, but it basically means the simple solution is usually the most obvious. The most obvious solution and simple solution is usually the one, right? So when we talk about power cords, like you mentioned, it could just be something unseated. Like if it's not getting power, check that power cord. Is it seated in where it's supposed to be? And is it good? Don't assume that the power cord is always good. I mean, you had an issue with a power cord. Doesn't look like it was damaged. For some reason, it was no good.
Yeah, and it was on
And
one
you
of
swap
the.
that out. And,
It was right before a show too. It was a mission critical
yep,
machine that I have here, and
yep,
I called Marty and I said it's not powering on, and he's like, "What do you mean?" So I said, "Well, I'm in the process of pulling it out of the rack." And he says, "Did you try a different outlet?" So right away, Marty goes into this exact thing. He starts, "Did you try a
yep,
different outlet?" "Yep, I tried that." I said, I said to him, or we both said it around the same time. I don't remember, but we were like, I said, "I'm in the process of going to change the power cord and go into a different." And sure enough, as soon as I changed the power cord, it worked. And I said, "All right, well, let me put it back in the rack to make sure that that was it, and plug it into the same spot." Sure enough, boom, it was instant. It was instant fix, right?
right, absolutely. And I love what you said about having the spare cameras and the and the converters. If you can, I mean, you hope you never have to use them, but that's a great way, especially if you're tight for time, knowing your system, knowing your signal flow. If it's just a matter of swapping another piece of equipment in that you know that's good and this solves the issue and you can get your show on there, that's great. And then you can always go back and confirm what went wrong. I love how you did it because you have a defined workflow there, a defined system where, okay, identify the bad piece of equipment, you swap in with something you know that's good, that's ready to go. Then after the show, you label it, you contact the man. You have a whole chain of workflow there to deal with that,
And
you know, and
let
that's
me
so
also state
important.
with that, with those cameras, each one of those cameras are properly white balanced because it's saved in the battery. If you noticed, I still had the batteries on them. So
Mhm.
eventually, that has to be done so long because the battery's going to drain by sitting there. But each one of them are set to the exact settings as one that I would have in use. So that way I can just simply swap it. And I have these conduit posts that are down. And back when I used them, I took a straight edge and I drew with a Sharpie marker on it the exact angle that those cameras needed to be set at the individual posts. So I knew in mission critical areas that I could simply take the other one off the hot shoe mount, put that on there, just get it, and it'll get me, for the most part, it'll get me pretty darn close to my shot accuracy, and then I can tweak from there. But it's not something where I'm like totally whacked out completely for a show. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you have that foundation ready to go, and you're able to make that quick again, Stephen, because you know you're set up, and also you're kinda using the 90-10 rule where you have all the preparations ready to go. It's like having that fire extinguisher. It's like having a smoke alarm in your house. Hopefully it never goes off. Hopefully you never use it. You change the batteries every year. Daylight savings time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully it never goes off. But if it does, you're darn glad you have it. Same thing with you.
Yeah.
You hope that you don't have to switch out something last minute. But if it saves the show and already know what the setup is, it's just a matter of swapping it out. You're ready to go.
Yeah, I think one of the things too that I'm realizing is that we've got a whole family of viewers that love talking and sharing and trying to figure out how together we make better video. And what do you guys think, Steve, Marty? You think we should maybe build a Facebook group called something like One Social Backstage where people can come in and test? Because that's the key to being ready for prime time. You don't wait until it's the real deal to be like, hey, let's see if this works. Get in, create your own closed Facebook group. If it's just you, you can stream only to yourself. You can see what that looks like. I've got one called the Digital Green Room that is full of nonsense because that's where I test. But that's where you get the power of it. And then you can invite other people in and say, hey, take a look at this. Does the audio sound right? Am I coming through the right sound card? Many times you guys know you'll have the nice big microphone, you'll be talking, and people are like, you sound like you're coming through the computer speakers because somewhere when you rebooted, the computer decided, hey, I want to set the internal microphone back to the primary. This is where you're going to be able to find a lot of value in being able to make inroads on that. And also in the chat, I want to give a shout out to Nico's asking if we're all in different cities, and we are. I'm in Washington D.C. Steve, you're in Ohio, and Marty, you're in Connecticut. So it's the power of the internet.
Absolutely. And Jeremy K in our Discord chat, and I apologize, I'm going to be looking down to read it just so I can get it, exactly. He said, for streaming as well, time of day and network usage is important for testing. I've done streaming for churches for years and find that I could do perfect tests during the week, but I get a full house on a Sunday morning and my stream continuously fails. And I had to perform a QoS on my network to fix it. And he's absolutely right. When we test with folks even here, we make sure that they're using the setup that they're going to use for the show. It doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do you any justice if you're going to test to be on a show on days or in areas or in a studio or on an internet connection that you're not using that day because bad things can happen, right, guys?
Just to add into that, Stephen, that you're absolutely right. Because I'll work with clients doing live streaming, and always, and I know Jeff, you do the same thing. You always do that test, but I always make sure that they're in the location that they're going to be streaming from, first of all, so you know what the bandwidth is. And I also do another thing. I also try to get them to test around the same time the show will be. It's always a few days before, but because the bandwidth, especially if you're doing it from your home or office, I mean, the bandwidth, depending on the node that you're on and the neighborhood, it could fluctuate, and it could really affect your bandwidth and the quality of the bandwidth that you're using. So if you can, it's always good to try to replicate the scenario that you're going to be in, time of day,
Right.
location, obviously, and all that stuff, and along with your lighting and all that. But yeah, replicate as close as possible to really get that
Yeah.
realistic test.
Yeah, and there's also a word we haven't talked about yet, which is contingency planning, right? Contingency, because later today, I'm the live stream provider for the county debates for our elections this year. I got multiple locations, which is always an interesting challenge. And you're right, you can go in, you can check the internet, go, hey, that looks like it's working great, but you have 400 people come in, all with a phone, wanting to connect to the Wi-Fi, news reporters, people wanting to do their own streams. And now all of a sudden you've got a real issue there. And the truth is, what are you going to do to test for that? Well, you really can't. So you have to have another idea on what you're going to do to back that up in some way, that if that really gets clogged, what am I going to do? And it makes things interesting to say the least, but contingency is part of the whole deal in troubleshooting.
So it looks like the consensus is from different people that they like the idea of a private Facebook group. So this is something we'll work on and see about getting something going with that. Um, it kind of goes with a little bit of the changes that are going to happen here. So we'll kind of go into that. But it's good to see that everybody wants to get involved with this and get going, because this is a way that you can get people that are like-minded to help you and tune in and say, hey, your audio is a little too hot, or Jeff says, oh, it might be potted up a little high. It's a great way to get some instant feedback and not take a lot of folks' time to do that, and try to give you the best possible results. But Marty, I know you have a few other things on the agenda there too that you want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, I'm looking to the side. I'm looking at my notes here, so that's why I'm looking here. Um, I can't overemphasize the importance of really knowing your signal flow when you set it up. And I think again, the story that you told with John Mahoney coming into your studio is a good one. It's a good example of that. But you really got to know. I know a lot of people we talk about, especially if you're just starting out, you're excited, you really want to go live stream, and you could do a simple setup and just go. But if you really don't understand how things work, chances are there's always going to be an issue that pops up. And that's going to enable you to address these issues quickly and also understand what went wrong and prevent it from happening in the future. So hopefully when you have an issue, it's just a one-time thing. You don't want it to be recurring. And if you don't really know your setup, you're really doing yourself a disservice. So when you're not doing a show, take your time when you're off. Put aside some time, turn off the social media, and really learn it's not necessarily the most fun thing in the world, but it will become fun once you learn how everything works and the light bulb goes on and say,
Yep.
it's less mysterious. I actually know how it works. Then
Yeah.
that's going to help your troubleshooting. When something happens, if you know how it works, you're going to know what to attack first. Because again, when you're doing troubleshooting, start with the simplest, work your way down, and do the same thing each time. So start with the most obvious. In fact, well, I'll always tell people when I'm recording, I'll usually do a reboot. Lots of times when people have trouble connecting, when I'm doing recordings and they're using a browser-based system, did you reboot? Something else is grabbing your stuff. When's the last time you reboot? And lots of times that's all it takes. And I don't know why. It could be a software thing, but it's a simple thing. Takes 2 minutes
Yep.
and you're ready to go. So start with it and work your way down, and then work on that and do the same thing each time. It's almost like, the space program. They have a checklist. They follow it religiously, and there's a reason why is because they don't want to duplicate the same mistake over and over again. That's
That's
very, very key.
that's
And
what I do.
I'm looking.
I go through everything that same way. I want to bring up a little while Marty's checking his notes there. So this goes outside of just broadcasting. So my mother-in-law was on vacation last week, and I handle the network at her pizza shop. So all their systems, their computer systems, the network, the security camera, I handled all that. I put it in. My father-in-law passed away 2 years ago, and so I worked very close with him on how everything was set up and installed, and I know it like the back of my hand. So when she's out of town, she don't know anything about it anyways, but she has them call me. And the one lady that was down there, they have touchscreen monitors. She said she was cleaning the monitor, and all of a sudden the monitor went out, but the computer stayed on, and she couldn't get the monitor back on. The first thing I said to her, did you check the plug? Yep, I checked the plug. I said, did you check the connection in the back of the monitor to ensure that it's making connection at the monitor? Yep, I did that. Okay. So the only other thing I could think of is maybe it was burned out. But I took a spare cable because I was convinced that it was the plug. I took a spare one that I have because I have 50 million. Again, redundancy, right? Want to make power cables go bad, right? So we want to make sure we have it. So I took those down. I took one down. I tilted the monitor back, and they had a power brick velcroed underneath there, just as a lot of the standard monitors that need that extra power. And it was really loose. So I got it to flicker to come on. So I pulled out the cable, put the new one in, plugged it in, boom, came right back on instantly. It took me 2 minutes, and They were messing with it for a couple hours before they even called me. So going back to what Marty said in the beginning, this applies to everything that you do when it relates to electronics and computers and what you're doing. Start with the simplest things, rebooting. Start with closing an application, restarting that application, going through your steps. If you didn't change anything, if nothing changed and no software was updated, the company that owns the software didn't decide that day that we're going to throw a monkey wrench in your broadcast and we're going to hit a switch that's going to cause that software to fail on you. That doesn't happen. I worked in support here for Telestream. I know we don't do that because we don't want people calling us in there when they're having problems because, that means they're unhappy. And, when you have to deal with unhappy people, it kind of puts you in an unhappy mood. It happens, right? So there, let me just get rid of that conspiracy theory. That doesn't happen. The software companies don't hit a switch as much as people think. Or when Facebook has an outage, it happens. They're not sitting there going, "Oh, we're going to mess with these churchgoers. We're going to flip the switch here on Sunday." It sounds funny, but honestly, how many times have you guys seen in broadcasting forums? People think that they think, "Oh, Facebook's sabotaging me today." It's like, really?
Yeah. Oh,
The
yeah.
last
I
thing they
mean,
want.
go ahead, Marty.
Oh no, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, sorry. No, that's exactly it. I mean, there's nobody who's working against you. 9 times out of 10, you're working against yourself. And I'll leave everybody with this. The one thing that if you do it, I can guarantee problems, and that is the belief that when you've got all the knobs perfectly set, that we just back away and we never touch them again. We don't want to understand how they work. We want to leave it like Wizard of Oz, right? Bad idea. Learn the reason why the knobs are where they're at and what you're trying to do, even on a small setting. And if honestly, this is not rocket science or magic. It's just you've put the time in to understand it. A couple months down the road, you're going to be like, I got it. I know where this needs to switch here and that kind of thing. And that leaves room for the real big problems that come out of nowhere. But yeah, don't do the thing where you don't touch the knobs. That's just not a good way of doing it.
No, absolutely. I'm one of those set it and forget it type people, but I understand why I said it and why I forget it. But
Why I said it, forget it. That's right.
right. So Jeff's 100% correct. You want to learn why your equipment's there. Again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. If you have somebody that's very knowledgeable that comes into your studio that sets you up or at your workplace, learn why they're doing it. Learn the why, the how, the when, the where. I mean, it sounds like we're going through an English class here, but it really, I mean, honestly, it really pays dividends because even my son, he wants to, he wants to be a YouTuber, as he calls it. He calls what I do being a YouTuber outside of what I'm doing here with Telestream and other things. But I'm teaching him at a young age what the why is: proper camera etiquette, proper technique, why we set up lights to shoot video, why it makes things, going through foundations with him so he understands, he sees a video show up on a TV, but he doesn't know how it got there. So taking that time, even though he's 7, I know what he can handle and what he can't. Go through and just teach him the basics, because then when he's my age, the kid's going to be a whiz. So, we just kind of want to emphasize that. We want to leave you with that, guys. I hope you found this show today to be something that you can take with you and learn from, and take some of the stories that you heard and apply them to your workflow. I know this is something that we hit hard on just because it happens a lot. It's not something, it happens to us, but again, I'm testing throughout the week. I'm trying things, testing with Marty, Jeff, whatever. We want to make sure things go off without a hitch. So with that being said, Marty, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, follow him on the social channels, Marty McPadden.
Thank you, Stephen.
And also Mr. Jeff in High Def.tv. You can follow Jeffrey Fitzgerald. Just look for Jeff in High Def. You'll see him all over the forums. He's always in there answering questions about Wirecast and video and all that good stuff.
Well, now you've given me PTSD about my wires. I need to go back under here and start labeling every single thing in like bright line marker. So
to be fair, in that video, okay, the wires that run underneath this that you saw, the mess with the Christmas lights, which those Christmas lights were here when I moved in, so I just left them because they were kind of nostalgia, old school. I had them when I was a kid, and I didn't have the heart to throw them out because I was like, man, I remember them 40 years ago, But those are all mainly extension cables for plugs. So when people go, man, there's a lot of cables. That's not my video cables. The video cables I showed you, they go up through the roof and that. But I think there's probably 2 cables under there for a monitor, and that's it. All the rest are extension cords. And I actually have spare extension cords that I laid back there just to throw them back there to make it look messy, because I was like, dang, all my wires are concealed. Where am I going to get wires to show this for this video? So that's all cleaned up. It doesn't look like that under there. But I hope you guys enjoyed today's show. And we'll see you next week for more on social, and we'll bring more to you here. So we'll see you next week.